Okay, welcome to Chapter 7. This is the last of the chapters on the police, and it's a transitional chapter in which it's going to bring us over to talking about the courtroom. And of course, in the courtroom, one of the most important components are the rules or the outline of it, if you like, and that's the Constitution. So, this is a chapter on the police and the Constitution, which will transition in next chapter, chapter 8, into one on how the Constitution interplays in the actual courtroom. But much of this is pretty important. Okay, so a few quick questions. I like to start all chapters with these questions that are hopefully a little outside of the chapter that might make you think. We're going to talk in this chapter about the crime control model, which is really very interested in enforcing the law, rapid application, solving the crime, as opposed to a due process model, which is more focused on the idea of making sure that the system is fair. So you should think, since this is the police and that tends to be focused on crime control, what groups would support a crime control model versus the due process and why. The next thing, and this is partially my generation's fault, something to think about here, is the law takes a long time to develop. A case can take years to go from being filed to get to the Supreme Court. And technology is much more rapid. And you've got people who are judges that are like myself, grew up in the 1960s, before computers, before internet, before email, before Twitter, and they have a profound ignorance about technology, and I think this leads to some issues. So ask yourself, does the generational issue, the idea that you don't have people who were raised in this electronic environment, does that have an impact on problems and understandings? Final thing, because we're going to spend some time talking about Terry v. Ohio, is stop and frisk. How it developed, how it is applied, how it's applied to street crime, but not things like white-collar crime or corporate offenses, and why. Why do we view those as more or less important? Okay. Again, these learning objectives, just a guideline of what I'm looking for in the chapter to cover. All right, I'd like to start with this quote. It's a quote that's often misused. And Benjamin Franklin was one of the founding fathers, and the founding fathers really are the substitution for if most medieval societies created a myth of legitimacy based upon the divine right of kings. The American Republic was no exception in that we needed a mythos. We needed a reason for our republic. And what we did is we created the myth of the Founding Fathers. Now, they all existed, but the Founding Fathers took the place of the divine right of kings. And we enshrine them in many ways. They have an almost deified perspective for most Americans. People will constantly say things like, well, that's not what the Founding Fathers wanted, or the Founding Fathers were so wise. That's perfectly fine. I'm not objecting to that, and I think when you had the constitutional conventions and the meeting in Congress that gave rise to the independence, 1776, you had some of the smartest people on the continent in the room. But having said that, let's look at what one of the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, who was the oldest, I believe, person in the room in 1776, had to say. Now, he was both at the he was at both conventions. He was in 1776, and he was in the one that founded the Constitution. And his famous quote is, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So Franklin's statement there is the idea that you may want a system that makes you safe, so that you can be free. But if you give up your freedoms to be safe, you won't either be free and you won't be safe. I would say the other most famous Franklin quote in this is at the end of the Constitutional Convention, and it's somewhat of an apocryphal quote. He's leaving the convention, and a bystander asks him, "Do we have a monarchy or a republic as a government?" And his reply purportedly was, "We have a republic if you can keep it." So this quote here about liberty is taken a little bit out of context, and it has, if you actually read into it, a little bit different meaning than when it's written. However, it points out today the inherent danger of giving the government so much power so that you're safe, but you give up all your rights. And we're seeing this played out. I mean, some people feel that this is going on with the COVID restrictions, that yes, we want to be safe from COVID, but no, I don't want you to mandate that I have to wear a mask. Yes, I want to be safe from spreading the disease, but I don't want you to be able to order me to take a vaccination. And it's a balancing act between these two things, between, if we look in the criminal justice sphere, the crime control and the due process. Okay, crime control and due process. This tension runs throughout, I would say, all societies in many ways. It's a struggle between the people who feel that a more regimented and controlled society is better and is safe, and those who feel that to make life worth living, the society has to be free, and that comes with problems. And we see this all the way from debates about gun control, where you could argue that crime control models would say, well, if we didn't have guns, we wouldn't have gun crime, so let's not have as many guns. Or things like the mask mandate, okay? So due process are the rules that the police follow in order to preserve the liberty that they're defending. And this tension exists between doing the job and following the rules, because sometimes the police don't follow the rules or don't want to follow the rules. All right, so let's look at one of the big areas that the police operate in, search and seizure. And here is, in the italics, the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, part of the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments. The right of the people to be secured in their persons, houses, paper, and effects, against unreasonable search and seizures shall not be violated. And no warrants shall be issued, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Now, this is written in the late 1700s, and it's been subject to more than now 220 years of interpretation. So, there are words in there that we have to define. The oldest functioning democracy on the planet, functioning Republican democracy on the planet, is the United States. And the shortest constitution on the planet belongs to the United States. And I don't think those two things are necessarily unrelated. What the Founding Fathers did is, I think they recognized, and again, this goes back to that mythos, right? I'm projecting myself here. They recognized you couldn't create an absolutely comprehensive document that would cover all possible arising circumstances, because you would have hundreds of thousands, millions of people interacting with each other, and you would have situations arise that you couldn't narrow down, you couldn't give precise directions to. So they gave general principles and ideals, and then these general principles are interpreted by the courts to be applied. So you got general ideas like due process or crime control being interpreted by the court. For example, here, what does it mean when we say due process? What does it mean when we say, or in this case, seizure or probable cause? All those terms have to be defined by a court or by somebody, whether it's a court or not. The Fourth Amendment contains two critical concepts that impact the police in this area, things that we're really concerned about. First of all, there's a prohibition, a barring that the police cannot engage in what the Constitution defines as unreasonable searches and seizures, which raises a question. First of all, what's a search? But second of all, what's unreasonable? And finally, what's a seizure? And do you have to have both of them together? I mean, is it okay to have a search that's unreasonable, not a seizure? A seizure that's unreasonable, but not a search? Further into the Fourth Amendment, it requires probable cause. Well, what's probable cause? How do we know it exists? And these are questions that have taken us and still take us today a long time to interpret and flesh out and deal with. So, reasonableness. The police must be reasonable when conducting a search or seizure. Now, ultimately, that's going to vary depending on the circumstance. If the police are conducting a search of a jaywalker versus someone they just caught killing 47 nuns with a spoon, pretty horrific image there, well, the reasonableness of the search is probably going to be different. Ultimately, the term reasonable varies by case, so no specific meaning for this term exists that can be easily applied to all case law. The concept of reasonableness is linked to our idea of probable cause, which leads us to the next size, probable cause. I guess a shorthand probable cause would be this, and take this with a big grain of salt because I'm just giving you a framework into which you can pour some of these bases for your probable cause. Is it more likely, would a reasonable person believe that this thing exists, that the right to search exists or the right to arrest exists? That would be probable cause. So where could belief or facts arise? Well, the greatest area it could arise is the personal observation of the police officer. Remember, we're focusing here on the application of the Constitution in the police. So where does the police officer, get the basis to make this observation and determination? Well, a big area, of course, is the training, their own physical observation, and their experience. So if they see someone staggering down the street, they might know, okay, the guy's drunk. Or if they see a car weaving, okay, the guy might be drunk. But if a toddler sees someone staggering, they might not know what an alcoholic is. They might not know what someone who's drunk is because they have no training or observation or experience. Information. The police can also establish probable cause based on information they're given. Obviously, it could be from other police officers. It could be from a member of the public. It could be from an undercover informant. It could be from an anonymous informant. So this information has to be something I believe to be reliable. If someone comes up and says, hey, I saw a guy that was, and I give a detailed description, 6'2", 220 pounds, wearing a blue khaki shirt with shorts, walking with a limp, with a mustache, and I tell you his hair color and eye color. I give you details, and I said, that guy just hit that woman over there who's unconscious in the parking lot. That's pretty good information. But if I come to you and I say, hey, I was conducting a seance, and my spirit guy said the guy that is killing women in town is a manifestation of a 6th century Visigoth warrior, and his name is Bob, and he's the janitor at the local hardware store. I mean, that's information, but it's not too reliable if you're getting it from someone who says it's a seance. I mean, you got a whole problem there. So we would say, well, we won't trust that too much. So personal observation can vary, can give you a lot or a little. Information can vary, can give you a lot or little. Now, evidence, the third area, again, can be nice. You can have probable cause based upon evidence. Did Fred shoot Bob? Okay. Bob was shot with a .22. We know that Fred owned a .22. We know that Fred was in the area. We know all these factors that show that it is likely that Fred shot Bob. We have evidence. Well, that's pretty good most of the time. Now, sometimes evidence is pretty weak. Well, we know that Fred was shot with a pistol, and we know Bob has a pistol, but we don't know what caliber or if he had it with him. So you have some evidence that Fred shot Bob, or Bob shot Fred, whatever one I was using there. But you don't have a great deal of evidence. You don't have something to really say, well, there's clear probable cause to arrest him. The weakest, although it can still be used, I think, to further investigations at least, is this last category, association. Is the individual that we're looking for a warrant to conduct a search or an arrest, is he knowingly associated or being found in the area of crime or criminality? So quickly, like this. Let's suppose you're Officer O'Malley, you're walking the beat. There's a known corner on your beat where people buy, pick your drug, I don't care, heroin. And this neighborhood is 99% inhabited by, again, pick your ethnic group you want, Afghani refugees. Okay, so you're walking the beat, you see someone in the corner who doesn't fit this at all. He's not an Afghani refugee. He's a South American Native American, so he's a Merid. Well, this guy's really out of place here. So do I have enough basis to arrest him for buying drugs? Well, no, you don't have enough basis for arresting drugs. You might have enough basis to investigate a little bit further. Another example, let's suppose that you suspect someone is soliciting prostitutes. You find someone in an area where there's prostitutes, and most prostitution, street prostitution, not all, but most street prostitution is men trying to purchase women. It's assignation. So you see a man talking to a woman in a known area of prostitution. Is that enough to arrest him for prostitution? No. Because, sometimes people will associate with prostitutes for different reasons. Maybe that guy is trying to get her off the streets. Maybe that guy is trying to tell her not to be a prostitute. Famously, if you read your Bible, Christ came across people that were getting ready to stone a woman, and for being unfaithful, arguably. And Christ's reply was, which of you is without sin? Let he is without sin cast the first stone, and everybody dropped their stone because nobody's without sin. And Christ said to the woman, go and sin no more. That's a very famous story. But what I'm trying to tell you there was Christ in an area where a crime was going on? Well, yeah. But is he a criminal? No, he's not. In fact, it's the opposite. So association, mere closeness and location of a crime, or knowing people who commit a crime, that's not enough 99% of the time to establish probable cause. All right, there are a few limits to this. Now let's talk about the first one, because there's many students that really don't like the exclusionary rule. So one of the limits to exclusionary rule, and this came about in a series of cases, really starting all the way back in the early part of the 20th century and really reaching its apex in the 1960s. Essentially what it says is, if the police do not have probable cause to conduct a search and or a seizure, but they conduct that search nonetheless, and they find during that search or that seizure something that is evidence against an individual, it's not admissible against him or her. So, quick example. The police want to search Bob's house. I guess poor Bob and Fred get used a lot in my examples. So they want to search Bob's house. So they just go to Bob's house. Bob's not home. They break in. They search the house. Now let's suppose they think Bob is a terrorist. And they search Bob's house looking for weapons of mass destruction. And they don't find any weapons of mass destruction, but they find some illegal drugs. And they say, okay, we're going to go arrest Bob for possession of illegal drugs. Well, the courts would say under the exclusionary rule that those drugs are not admissible against Bob because his constitutional right to be secure, remember in his person, places, things, his home, were violated. So it's not admissible. This is the exclusionary rule. You exclude evidence that the police have gathered illegally, but important point here, you only exclude against the person whose constitutional rights were violated. So let's suppose they search the house, they find illegal drugs, and it leads them to a drug dealer. Well, the drug dealer's rights weren't violated, okay? So it's inadmissible against Bob, but it may be admissible against the drug dealer. All right. There's one corollary that goes on and makes this a little bit more complex, and that's called the fruit of the poisonous tree. That's an extension of the exclusionary rule doctrine. Essentially what it says is, I conduct an illegal search of your house. In that house, let's suppose I find a diary. And the diary says, I threw the body down the old well on Glenwood Avenue. So now you drive to the old well on Glenwood Avenue, you look in the well, and there's the body. So the body wasn't found directly because of the illegal search. It was found indirectly. It's still inadmissible against Bob. But again, if Bob had a co-conspirator, if the diary said something like, Fred and I did this thing together, well then it still can be used against Fred. So exclusionary rule is very narrow. But it was so unpopular that, I hesitate to use the word conservative, but it's so unpopular that the conservative Supreme Courts, starting really in the 1970s, began to put limits on it. One was inevitable discovery. So let's suppose the police are conducting a search of a field, an open field where they don't need a warrant. At the same time, they're conducting an illegal interrogation of a suspect. And the suspect says, yes, the body is located by the old well on Glenwood Avenue. Well, the police are already searching that area. They're going to get there. They're going to find that body. But they can kind of short-circuit it by finding it. The courts would say, yes, it was an illegal interrogation. Yes, evidence was derived from it. But they were inevitably going to find that evidence. Therefore, the evidence is admissible. Good faith. If the police believe that they had a valid warrant or valid probable cause, then what they discovered, and they have to reasonably believe it, they can't just say, oh yeah, I thought I could torture someone, or oh yeah, I thought that a warrant drawn in crayon by a third grader was valid. It's got to be pretty good. Then if they find evidence, it's admissible. So, quick example that actually happened here in Wake County. Police officer sees a car that has a out taillight. And it's got one taillight that's no good. Now, the officer believed that under North Carolina law, that if one taillight is out, it was a basis for a stop. It turned out that the actual law said, well, no, you have to have both taillights out for it to be illegal. It's kind of a quirk in North Carolina law. But he didn't know this, so he stops and he searches and he finds crime. He finds evidence of crime, drugs or guns, doesn't matter. Went up to the Supreme Court of the United States. Supreme Court of the United States said, since the officer had a good faith belief that the law existed, then the search was legal. Now, it's clear if we look at the struggle between the crime control model that we talked about and the due process model, that since, I would say, about 1975, maybe even a little bit before, the court has been carving out more and more exceptions to the exclusionary rule. It's not a popular political ideal, and as the court has moved steadily to the political right, more emphasis on crime control, less emphasis on liberty and freedom, or due process if you prefer. All right. Privacy. Privacy is a crucial concept in the interpretation. If you think about this, again, this is something the Founding Fathers didn't necessarily spell out, but it makes a lot of sense. If I'm sitting in my home, curtains drawn, in my living room, I have a greater expectation that what I'm doing is private than if I'm walking down the street. Privacy is important. A search is an intrusion by the government of a citizen's reasonable expectation of privacy. So the court asked two questions. Should you have this expectation of privacy? You're home, you're in your own house, yeah, you have pretty good expectations. You're in general public, at a rock concert, yeah, you don't have as much expectations. Does society recognize this expectation? The big kind of gray area that a lot of cases come out of is automobile searches. If you see people driving on the Beltline, they often think that they're invisible. You'll see them singing or, putting on makeup or pick on their nose or doing things that you wouldn't do in front of other people necessarily. But the whole fact that you're in public driving a car that's got windows really means that you have very little expectation of privacy, regardless of what you think it is. Now, technology gives rise to conflicting expectations of privacy. And prior to, I would say, the 20th century, the courts really looked at a physical intrusion. They wanted to see that the police were physically entering an area in order to call it a search. But the problem is that new technology has given rise to new circumstances. And this is a good example how you can't have a super specific constitution. Because in 1776 or 1787 or 1789, we're talking Constitution, the Bill of Rights, a lot of things didn't exist that exist today, like telephones or Twitter or email. So as new technology develops, the court has to address if, when the police look into it or utilize it, is it a search? Or what is your expectation of privacy there? And this, by the way, I think has a lot to do with generational issues. 50 years ago, really before the internet becomes as invasive as embedded in our society as today, a lot of private communication was done in writing via mail, and that enjoyed a very high expectation of privacy. Now, most people today, they don't write physical letters. They may write an email or send a quick message. And this is, again, I think there's a generational issue here. There's a failure to understand how society has changed as much, or maybe an intentional decision not to address the issue. All right, so let's talk about warrants. Now, I had been speaking about this, and I said search warrants and arrest warrants. So all warrants, whether you're arresting someone, you're taking them into physical custody, which is a seizure, or a search warrant, whether you're looking for something, both have to be supported by probable cause. Now, what do you have to show at the beginning of this? Well, the first thing you have to show is there's been a crime. So if you come to the police and you say, I'm going to pick on poor Bob and Fred again, I think Fred is up to something bad. And the police say, what? And you say, I don't know, but it's just something bad. Well, that's not enough for the police to go get a search warrant. If you come up to the police and say, Fred is selling drugs, all right, that's a crime. We're going to assume these are illegal drugs. Great. So we have a crime here. Now the second, is evidence of that crime or location of the suspect you're going to bring him in likely to be found in the area searched or the person you're arresting? So, if you say Fred's selling drugs and he sells them every Tuesday on the street corner of 5th and Main. All right, well, can we go get a search warrant to search his office? Maybe not. Because if his drugs are only present, he's only doing them in one location, then, by what right are you going to search his office? Let's move on. I included this, and this is not in your text, obviously. That's a copy of what, when you apply for or fill out a North Carolina search warrant. A little bit later in here, you'll see a copy of a North Carolina arrest warrant. So the warrant, when you're arresting or searching for something, has to describe where you're searching, who you're looking for, and what you're trying to seize or arrest. It's a written declaration. Now, it has to be made under oath, and that's important because if someone lies on a search warrant, if they say, yeah, I saw Fred dealing drugs, and that's the basis, and they swear an oath, and it becomes a legal document, that's perjury if it's not true. Although that's a little less strict. It's pretty rare to see a perjury charge or obstruction charge arise out of this. During a search, the police have to act reasonably. No excessive or unnecessary violence. And it's limited when they search and where they search. So a quick example here. The police have a warrant. This is based on a real case. Police have a warrant to look for a fugitive. And the fugitive is an adult male. And he's 6 foot, 200 plus pounds. The police go to a house. They show a warrant to the person who's in the house. They enter the house. They go down to the basement. In the basement is a foot locker. The foot locker is a foot wide, 18 inches deep, 2 feet long. Can't be a person in there, but they open it nonetheless, and they search it, and they find something illegal. That search is illegal. That search has triggered the exclusionary rule. What they found in that locker is inadmissible because the search warrant said we're looking for John Doe. John Doe can't possibly be in there. So if you search there, that's an illegal search. What can be seized under warrant? Here are some items that can be seized. Items that result from a crime. You rob a bank, you get the money from the bank, then clearly we can seize the money from you. Items that are inherently illegal to possess. If you have heroin or plutonium or something that no one is allowed to have in the general public, we can seize that. Evidence that can be called evidence of a crime. So you have a videotape that was shooting the bank robbery. It's across the street. It's got a picture of the door. You can go to that bodega or 7-Eleven or the Piggly Wiggly or whatever it is that's got the camera. You can have a warrant and you can seize that videotape. Also, things that were used in the commission of the crime. Again, you have a bank robbery. Someone lawfully owns, maybe they have a pistol permit, maybe they have a right to own a 45 caliber pistol, but that pistol was used, you think, in the commission of the robbery. You can seize it. All right, next. Searches done without warrants. Now, a lot of searches are conducted without warrants. One of the ones is if you have a lawful arrest. Now, if the arrest is based on a warrant for arrest, different story. But a lot of arrests, police didn't go in front of a neutral judicial magistrate and conduct a search. And get a warrant, excuse me. So one of the things you can do is you're bringing someone to custody. Well, you got to worry as a police officer they have a gun. So you can confiscate any weapon that they have on them. You can pat them down. You can also seize any evidence that they have on them. So this is called a search incident to lawful arrest. If I have a valid reason to bring you into custody, then I can search you. Now, when I do this, okay, where can I search? So let's suppose I arrest you. You're walking to your car. You're not at your car yet. You don't even have your keys out. Your car is parked on the next parking level. And I arrest you in the stairwell before you get to the parking level. I can search you, and I can search the area under your immediate control, which is called the arm's reach doctrine. But I can't, without a warrant, go up to your car, open it up, and search. Because that's not under your control. Now, I could wait. I may want to search your car without warrant. So what I could do is I could say, I'd really like to search his car. I don't have a warrant to do so, but I do have probable cause to arrest him. I'll wait till he gets to his car. And then when he's in his car, I can search that area of his car within arm's reach. It's a perfectly valid thing. The police do it all the time. But if they arrested him before he got to the car's not searchable. Search is made with consent. This is a big one. If you're a cop and you go to a suspect and you say, can we search? They might not have probable cause. They might not have an articulable suspicion. They might have the weakest of bases, mere association. Hey, you're a stranger in this neighborhood. I don't know you. So if I go to you and I say, can I search? When the word yes comes out of your mouth, there's no more constitutional protection for you. This is the most common type of police search. Once you've consented, there's really nothing for the courts to look at anymore. It's going to simply be assumed that the search is okay. Now, it's got to be voluntary. So if you come up to someone who's underage or low intelligence, or in a condition where they couldn't consent, then we could question whether there was true consent. We could also look for physical coercion. If the police take a billy club, hit you in the head and say, hey, can I search? And you say no, and they hit you again, they say, can I search now? Well, then any consent after that's not voluntary. Also, we can look at things like, well, if you consented to answer a few questions, and 2 hours later they're still asking you questions, but haven't developed enough for arrest, okay, it becomes more problematical. Some recent cases. Warrantless searches of cars near international borders, completely okay. You have far fewer constitutional rights near an international border than you do inside the United States. Absent suspicious circumstances, the police do need warrants to draw blood when charging or investigating a DUI. So simply because you stop someone, you say, yeah, I don't smell alcohol, I don't have it, he wasn't driving erratically, but I'd like to conduct a intrusive search by drawing blood. You better have a warrant. Alright, I'm not going to go too far into that third one. Searches of automobiles. You know, there's a lot of this, and if you take our constitutional law course at Wake Tech, you're going to learn a lot more. But suffice it to say that you don't have a great expectation of privacy in cars, so there's more warrantless searches. If you're arresting me for another crime, you can search my car. If it's non-intrusive, such as an example of drug dogs, and I can search pretty much anything in a car. Why I stop the car is irrelevant. If I've got a basis to stop it, searches are okay. Alright, another exception to searches, plain view, which has a relative, I would say, in legal concepts called open fields. Plain view says the police do not need a warrant to search, and it can form the basis of arrest, if they can see an illegal item, if they're in the area lawfully. So I see someone handing somebody else a packet of white powder. Well, I have a reasonable belief that people just don't go around handing out packets of white powder. Now, different story if you're in a restaurant and you say, hey, pass me the salt. But 99 times out of 100, people passing packets of white powder in return for getting cash, someone's dealing drugs. So if I saw that happen, I could search and I could arrest. Now, open fields, this comes as a surprise to a lot of people because people tend to think, well, it's my property, what I do in my property, my business. And that's certainly true, particularly inside what's called the curtilage. But basically, areas outside of the home, you have a very low expectation of privacy. The police may, without warrant, enter your land, and they can look around. Now, if they're ordered to leave, a different story, okay? But the police are not absolutely prohibited from, going and looking on your land because they don't have a warrant. That's open fields. All right, which introduces electronic surveillance. I guess gives us transition to electronic surveillance. And again, some of this is a constitutional issue. And some of it is a generational issue. The police, at the start of this, of course, it's 1780s or 1850s. There's really no recording of conversations. But gradually, we developed technology that allowed us to record. So the question became, do the police need the consent of both parties having the conversation? So you hear Fred saying he's going to kill Wilma. He's talking to his buddy Barney. We're going to do a Flintstone scenario here. Fred says to Barney, I'm so tired of being locked out of the house, I'm going to kill Wilma. Now, if in some states, and it varies from state to state, we're basically a one-party consent state. In some states, if either Fred or Barney told the police, yeah, there's some death threats going on, you can tape my conversation, then the police don't need a warrant. But if neither party consented, then the police better have a warrant to tap any conversation. They better have their probable cause to believe a crime. They better describe what they're hoping to overhear. Now, electronic communication has far less protection. Emails enjoy a very low expectation of privacy, and text messages lower still. A lot of this law, I would say, even though it's somewhat settled, really, I think the great constitutional fights about it are yet to happen. So, I would say by the time, if you all are going to have a career in law enforcement, 10, 20 years on, there's going to have to be a more definitive understanding of the technology. But suffice it to say that basically if one party consents, then you can listen in one-party consent states. In some states, both parties have to consent. We're basically a one-party consent state. Cell phones, a couple quick things. The police can simulate cell towers that track phone locations without warrant. It seems to be a permissible activity. Searching phones. Actually searching a phone after arrest seems to now require a warrant, which raises some interesting questions about when I can compel people to give me passwords. And I'd love to have a 20-minute discussion about that, but this is an intro class, not the con law class. We're going to have to move on. Because I really want to focus, this is a big part of what's left of this chapter, on arguably, I would say, for law enforcement, one of the most important cases of the 20th century, and that's Terry v. Ohio. So let me give you first a very simplified, somewhat incorrect background, just so you can frame what Terry v. Ohio is all about. So you have Officer O'Malley, who's walking the beat, and he sees, we're going to make it just one suspect, it was multiple suspects in Terry, he sees bad guy Bart outside of a liquor store at night, and he says, hey, that liquor store is getting ready to close, and Bart looks like a pretty rough character, and I think he's up to no good. I've really got association maybe. I don't have enough probable cause to arrest him, but I want to stop and question, but boy, Bart's a tough looking dude. And if he's got a gun and I'm talking to him, he's going to be able to pull that gun out and kill me. So I want to stop him. And in order to secure my own safety, I want to frisk him for a weapon. So this is exactly what happened in Terry v. Ohio. The police officer stops, in the real case, multiple suspects, but we'll just say one. He stops the individual. He pats him down. He finds a weapon. The individual was not allowed to possess a weapon. He was an ex-felon. Goes up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court rules that the police, if they have reasonable cause to believe a suspect is armed and dangerous, during an investigatory stop, they may stop him and frisk him. The detention has to be brief, and the frisk, the pat-down, can't be intrusive. So this tool for law enforcement was created in 1968. And at first it looked like a fairly limited tool, right? Okay, circumstances where the police officer believes his life's in danger, great, gotcha. They can pat down. But quite quickly, the police realized, wow, we can use this to do a lot more. We can use it to stop people we think have drugs on them. And when we pat them down, maybe we'll find the drugs. So the courts allow these stops under a totality of circumstance test. Given the totality of circumstances, is a stop reasonable? Now, let me just share this one statistic. 6% of stop and frisks result in arrest, which means there's a 94% failure rate. This would seem to say, if you're looking at the statistics, at least in one way, that Terry is just a pretext for the police to conduct searches that aren't very good, that they don't really have a totality of circumstance for, but nonetheless is very helpful in crime control. So again, you're going to see this tension between, do you want to live in a society where the police can just search you whenever they want? Or do you want to live in a society where you're safe and the police can search you when they want? So the stop is your brief detention, and you still need a suspicion. I can't stop you just because it's a Wednesday. The pat down is for the weapon. Again, take that with a grain of salt, because one of the things the police can say is, well, I didn't want to touch him, so I told him to turn his pockets inside out. Well, when he does that, the drugs that he's carrying fall out. Now, plain view. Remember, going back to early in the chapter, I can arrest you for possession of drugs. It can lead to, quote unquote, inadvertent discovery. Then the question became, because any tool that's given, you're going to try to use it to the maximum extent. How long can I detain him? Hey, I can't do my stop and frisk right now. Can I wait a little bit? Can I wait for other people to show up? Can I actually take the suspect downtown? This was called a fishing expedition and was done. Also, what are the total circumstances that allow me to stop? So here's a quick demographics. If we look at the population in New York City, it's about a third. If we skew in the others, black, white, Hispanic. And again, you know I have problems with breaking it down this way, but we're just going to use the data that we have. So who gets stopped for Terry stops? Well, blacks, even though they represent just 25% of the population, get stopped 53% of the time. So they get stopped twice as often. Whites, even though they represent 33% of the population, only get stopped a third of what they should statistically, if everybody is equally being stopped. Now what that means, if you compare blacks to whites, it's not like, well, whites are getting stopped a little less and blacks are getting stopped a little more. You take the twice as many for blacks, okay, and a third as many for whites, which means if you are black compared to a white person, you're about 6 times as likely to be stopped by the police. And again, you're not finding anything in 96% of the cases. Now, according to law, a person's race, gender, and ethnicity alone is not a reasonable suspicion to stop and frisk. But they do play some role. Now, this is going to trigger kind of a loaded term, racial profiling. And racial profiling is the practice of targeting people for police action based solely upon their race, ethnicity, or national origin. But I like to start off talking about this, talking about gender. And let's talk about the most serious crime there is, and that's murder. And if we looked at statistics for murder, you would find that, at least for incarceration rates, 8 or 9 out of 10, let's just take the higher number to make it more dramatic, 9 out of 10 people in prison for murder are men. So if you had a murder and you were trying to determine if you were going to stop someone who committed the murder, and you had 3 people walking near the crime scene, and you've got time to stop one, here's my question for you. Is it profiling, in this case gender profiling, to stop the man and not the woman? And if you say, well, the statistical probability of them being the murderer is really high, you're relying upon a statistic based on gender. And let me give you another example that's perhaps a little bit more. We're not going to touch race just yet. We'll leave that for last. Let's talk about ethnicity. You're a police officer on a U.S. border. You see someone who's got a darker complexion, or no, say that you see someone who's got, let's leave it at that. You've got someone who's got a darker complexion, black hair, and they're near an international border. Should I be able to stop and say, okay, are you a U.S. citizen? What are you doing on the border? Does the fact that you've got someone who doesn't look like an American, whatever an American is here, and I'm using a loaded term, hold on, is it okay? Well, let me flip that and ask this question. Suppose you're at the border between Vermont and Canada, and you see a white person. Can you say, well, most Canadians are white, eh? So, those hockey players, they'll sneak over the border sometime. Can I stop only white people? Do I have to let anybody that looks Hispanic or black alone because I'm going to racially profile or ethnically profile? And you can see how this is a difficult thing. We do use race, ethnicity, national origin. We do use gender to profile. The question is, I'm going to throw one more thing in there. The question is, is it okay, depending upon why I'm doing it? Okay. I'm going to throw in one more thing, and that is self-fulfilling prophecy here. Looking at statistics in North Carolina, we are pretty certain, given all sorts of studies and analysis, that African Americans and whites in North Carolina use marijuana at the same rate. About, let's just say 20%. Great. But if you're an African American, the probability of you being arrested for possession is 3.5 times greater, 350%, or 3.5 times greater than if you're white. Now, if you just looked at those statistics, people arrested for marijuana, 3.5 times more likely if you're black to be arrested. And you use that as the basis of your search, then searches of African Americans make more sense. Well, sure, because last year, 3.5 times the number of people arrested were African Americans, so of course I'm going to search them. But if those searches are based upon racial profiling, if the only people you're disproportionately searching are African Americans, then of course the numbers that you're going to show up in your data are going to be skewed by race. In other words, to use an absurd example, if the only people you arrest for speeding are albino people from Papua New Guinea who are women, then if you look at next year's speeding statistics, you're going to see that women from Papua New Guinea who are albino constitute a large block of the people arrested. Well, then that's who I'll keep stopping in the future. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It doesn't mean that other people aren't speeding. It just means that I'm going to focus on them. Arrest is the seizure of a person. Arrest can arise in a number of cases. You got a warrant, that's the best. When I was at the police academy, I would say over and over again, the best basis for an arrest is you've already gone in front of a judicial magistrate and you've said there's probable cause, they've agreed, they issue it. It gives you civil protection. You see a crime in their presence, or you've got evidence that you discover. You have to intend to make the arrest, you have to have the authority, if you like South Park, to make the arrest, and you've got to actually seize the individual, and they've got to know they're under arrest. That's an arrest. The arrest without warrant is a preference, and the arrest should state who you're arresting, why you're arresting them, and where they're likely to be. Most arrest warrants, search and arrest, are requiring you to knock. We do allow no knocks, although they've been under a lot of criticism lately because they've resulted in some real tragedies. But we allow no knocks if we believe the suspect is armed and dangerous, that evidence could be destroyed, or there's an ongoing felony. That's a picture of that North Carolina arrest warrant. Notice there's a box up here where you could put a picture. If you make an arrest without warrant, it is lawful, but the courts become a little more suspicious. You better have your probable cause. And I would say, even though it's not explicitly stated, you better have a little bit more probable cause than you'd need for a simple warrant. You got to show there's a danger of the suspect fleeing, should be not flying. If he flies, it's pretty impressive. Or evidence is going to be destroyed. Location's also key. So in North Carolina, for example, the courts are hyper concerned about a person's house. If you're going to make an arrest of someone in their house, you better have a warrant. All right. Fifth Amendment. No person, and I'm going to skip over some of it, shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against themselves. You can, however, be required to provide identification, and it doesn't protect you against, particularly if there's a warrant, having to give up your DNA, your fingerprints, or physical evidence like hair samples or what clothing you were wearing. The police, if they don't arrest you or haven't arrested you yet, can ask any question they want. They don't need probable cause or warrant. And they can use anything you say against you. So, one of the things I tell police officers is the smartest thing you can do is to talk to a suspect before you arrest him. Because none of the constitutional protections are triggered. And you can develop your case, you can increase your probability of conviction by getting the evidence, and that evidence is going to be admissible against them. Conversely, when I talk to clients or suspects, I say the smartest thing you can do when the police come up to you is say, "Am I under arrest? No. Then I ain't talking to you." You can refuse to answer any question if you want. But a refusal to answer a question can't trigger the police officer saying, well, he would have answered if he was innocent, now I'm going to arrest him. The exercise of a constitutional right cannot be the basis of an arrest. Once you're actually under arrest, you have a much greater right to remain silent. Of course, we've got Miranda, and you all have heard of Miranda, the right to remain silent. You've got the right to remain silent. Everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to have an attorney present. If you can't afford an attorney, will appoint them. Then do you understand the rights? The Miranda, which is one of the high watermarks of the due process struggle, came in '66, but it is limited. It's limited. I want to emphasize that. First and foremost, it applies when you're in custody and when we're questioning you, not when you volunteer information, not when the police are just asking questions and not interrogating you. Non-testimonial questions are not viewed as discriminatory. What's your name? Where do you live? Unless witnessed by the police, there are three options to identify a suspect: show-ups, photo arrays, and lineups. Basically, the police can compel you to be in these. The courts are a little suspicious of show-ups. Photo arrays, they're not in love with. They really prefer lineups. And again, if you take the con law course, I think you're going to get a lot more basis here. Violating the Fifth Amendment. It is known, and one of the most egregious examples occurred in Chicago between 1972 and 1991. The police commander ran a unit that tortured suspects to get them to confess. Physically coerced confessions are not rare. They do occur. And sometimes it's a physical coercion of torture, like the Chicago cases. Sometimes it's intrusive psychological pressure, isolating an individual, telling them that, and you can tell an individual almost anything. Oh, things will go easier on you if you confess. That's not true. One of the examples here is the Central Park Five. This occurred in New York City, where 5 individuals were accused of raping a woman in Central Park. They were all very young. They were interrogated by the police. Confessions were obtained. They served some of them up to 13 years in prisons till the DNA came back, and it was actually, the Central Park 5 is in the 90s, but the DNA came back that the real rapist was somebody else. So you eventually had physical evidence that, oh, we got the wrong guys. And I think, I'd like to point this out, is that one of the real dangers of coerced confessions is you can get the wrong person, which means the real rapist, the real murderer, the real terrorist is still out there. Yeah, you've solved the case, but you've solved it by catching the wrong person. Not just that his rights have been violated, but the real danger is still out there for society. All right, a little bit longer than I like. That's about an hour, but when you're ready, we'll move on to Chapter 8, which will be our transition over to the courts.